Welcome to Promethean Action Saturday Night Class Series. This is Tony Pappert speaking to you from Michigan. I'll be your host. Tonight's class is Trump is Right About Tariffs with the historian Robert Ingram. So with that, uh, let me pass it to Bob Ingram.
Hello, everyone. So I cannot see what the attendance is. I wouldn't be surprised if we had a fairly small gathering here tonight for obvious reasons, which is the election on Tuesday, and everyone is out doing their utmost to ensure that Donald Trump is reelected to the presidency. But this class will be posted on both the Promethean Action website, on Rumble, I believe on YouTube. So, it will be available for anyone to view at their leisure. I think it's an important topic. And as I think everyone knows, Donald Trump has recently been talking a lot about tariffs. And he's been talking a lot about President McKinley, um, who was the champion of high tariffs, at the turn of the century, 1900. Um, and it's not that this is something new that Trump is talking about, but if you look at his recent speeches, his recent interviews, he has gone out of his way to raise this topic and to make it very clear that he intends to act upon this, even more so than during his first administration. Um, Now, one of the places that he did that was in an interview that he recently did with the editor in chief of Bloomberg News, a man named John Micklethwait. And I want to read to you a little part of that interchange. Can you put that up on the screen, Tony?
Yes.
All right, there it goes. It's uh, now just for people to know, John Micklethwait is currently the editor in chief of Bloomberg News. He has been the editor of Bloomberg News for 9 years. Prior to that, he was the editor in chief of The Economist magazine for 9 years. The Economist being sort of the premier publication and mouthpiece of the City of London financial institutions. In 2016, Micklethwait was appointed, by I guess the Queen was still alive at that point. He was appointed commander of the Order of the British Empire. So he has been honored by the British monarchy. He has spent the last 18 years heading up two of the premier British Empire publications and news agencies. So that's who he is. He is a spokesman for the City of London. So Trump, sat down with him and did an interview. And this is just one quote that's up on the screen from that interview where Trump is talking to Micklethwait, and he says, "To me, this is Donald Trump speaking. To me, the most beautiful word in the world the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. It's my favorite word. Dot dot dot. It must be hard for you, that is Micklethwait, it must be hard for you, having spent 25 years opposing tariffs, for someone to explain to you that you are totally wrong." So, this is Trump face to face with a leading spokesman for the City of London, for the British financial empire, um, saying that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English dictionary. Or you could take that down. Now, look, I'm going to run through a lot tonight, and I think the place to begin is for people to understand that the proposal for high protective tariffs is not something new. It's not something weird. It's not something crazy. It's not something out of the ordinary. But that the American economic system, the American economic system of our republic, was built on protective tariffs. That high protective tariffs were a part of this nation from its very inception. And it really began in the first year, the very first year of the Washington administration, when Congress passed and Washington signed into law the Tariff Act of 1789, which imposed a tariff on imported goods of around 20%. Sometimes it was a little lower, sometimes a little higher, but it averaged around 20%. Today, if you propose a 10% tariff, people freak out. But from the beginning, we had a 20% tariff, and this continued. And I think the best thing to do here, Tony, would be to put up the graph. No? Yeah, okay, that's good. So this is a graph of tariff rates. Now, there's a couple of things wrong with it, which I'll tell you right off the top. One is it starts about 1820, so it does not go back to the 1789. But believe me, tariff rates between 1789 and 1820 never went below 20%. They were 20%, 25%, 30%. So it begins in 1820. The other thing is that if you look on the left, it says 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%. That's a little misleading because, according to the graph, we had tariff rates of 60% on a couple of occasions. That was never the case. Um, this is actually a graph on uh, tariff rates on what are called dutiable products. These are what are called this is what is called dutiable tariff rates, which means these are the tariffs that were imposed upon goods that were subject to tariffs, because not everything that's imported is hit with a tariff. There are goods that are imported tariff free. So this is the rate of tariffs on only on those dutiable goods that are, come under that are, subject to having tariffs on them. Nevertheless, it's a pretty accurate chart, and it was the best one I could find. And as you can see, um, you know, between 1789, we'll start with 1789, and 1950, between 1789 and 1950, tariff rates never fell below 20%. That's 160 years. For the first 160 years of the existence of the United States of America, tariff rates never fell below 20%. There's two instances in there where they dipped slightly below it. Most of the time, tariff rates were 30% or higher. And then you have, um, the peak um, tariff years. You have presidents who imposed high protective tariffs. You see in around 1830 there, the first one they call it the Tariff of Abominations. Well, it was called the Tariff of Abominations by the people who opposed it. They said these tariffs are an abomination. Um, but this was a tariff rate of over 40%. Forget the 60% on thing, but it was over 40%. This was brought in 1828 by John Quincy Adams. Um, so he was a champion of high protective tariffs. Then you can see they gradually decline, and this is particularly after 1828. You get the steady decline going into the Civil War. This is under Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and some of the Democratic presidents who came after them, like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. And by the time of the Civil War, tariff rates had dropped to slightly below 20%, about 20%, slightly below. And then you got Abraham Lincoln. And under Abraham Lincoln, Congress passed and Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Tariff. And you could see that there in 1861. And that brought tariff rates back up over 40%. Um, and from there, from 1861 to 1901, for 40 years, is this is called in history books the era of American protectionism. Between 1861 and 1901, for 40 years, 4 decades, tariff rates almost never fell below 40%. And in 1891, they were increased again. This was the McKinley tariff, William McKinley. This, I believe, despite what the chart says, was the highest tariff in the history of the United States. General, in terms of the general tariff rate. But it was, this was the era of American protectionism. This was also the period of the most rapid, the most in-depth, the most powerful development of our productive economy in the United States. Manufacturing, industry, technology, infrastructure, modern agriculture. This period of the era of protectionism was, in those years, there was an explosion of productive economic activity. Now, you see the big dip there in 1913. That is Woodrow Wilson. I'll talk a little bit more about him later. But, Wilson slashed tariffs dramatically. He reduced the tariff rate from more than 40% to below 15%, which is the lowest they had been since the founding of the United States. And then, after Wilson left office, tariff rates began to go back up. And then in 1930, you get the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which I will talk a little bit more again about later. But then they start to go down somewhat. Now, people say that Franklin Roosevelt was opposed to tariffs. That's really not true at all. I mean, not at all. He didn't like the provisions of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, but he maintained high protective tariffs. And at the time that Roosevelt died, the U.S. tariff rate was about 38%, 35 to 38% at the time of Roosevelt's death. That is still pretty high, 35 to 38%. When it all changed was under Harry Truman, when we joined the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs in 1947. And then, you could see, where it says GATT 1947, it just falls off the cliff. So I'm going to get back to this, but you could take that chart down for now, okay? That was just to give you a sense of this. So again, between 1789 and 1950, America had high protective tariffs. They dropped somewhat in the 1850s. They were slashed under Woodrow Wilson. But outside of those two exceptions, throughout most of American history, tariffs were in the range of 30 to 40%. 30 to 40%. So, when we talk about the American system of economics, we tend to focus on a lot of the times on this question of national banking and national sovereignty over our financial system. And that is obviously critical, um, to get America out from under the thumb of the central banking system, to determine our own financial, destiny, to bring back a system of public credit as it was created by Alexander Hamilton. But oftentimes, excuse me, people denigrate or ignore um, the fact that throughout the entirety of this, um, protective tariffs were an absolutely key component, not a minor component, a key component of the development of a productive, future-oriented, technologically progressive, economy in the United States. Um, the the Now, one of the charges that is waged against Trump on the issue of tariffs, and you heard this when he was president, from some people, some very, very stupid people, um, that that Trump was waging trade war against China by slapping high tariffs on some of these Chinese goods. That he was waging trade war. That this was aggressive. That this was blah 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 blah. You've heard it all. Um, you know that this was hostile. And what have you, what have you. I mean, this is all just nonsense. I mean, first of all, if you have high protective tariffs, the country that you are imposing these tariffs on is not going to like it. They would rather be able to dump their goods in the United States, undersell U.S. producers, and make a fortune doing it. And if you put tariffs on their goods, which keeps them from doing that, they're going to be unhappy about that. You know, that's the nature, one of the side effects of tariffs. That doesn't have anything to do with trade war. You're not trying to destroy these countries. And really, the best example of this, of the proper approach to tariffs, was developed by William McKinley, the individual that Trump has held up again and again as sort of his, the person he's following on tariff policy. McKinley was the author of the 1891 McKinley Tariff. He was known as Mr. Tariff. And then as president, he maintained this policy of high protective tariffs. But McKinley also developed this notion of what he called reciprocity. Reciprocity. And what he said was that, that the way we are going to deal with countries is that he had a term for it. He said whether or not we impose tariffs against another nation is going to be based on whether those countries treat our exports in a reciprocally unequal and unreasonable fashion. In other words, to give you an example, I'm probably mispronouncing that word, but to give you an example, while he was president, he increased tariffs on all imports from Great Britain from 35% to 43%, kind of like what Trump was doing with China. He increased imports on Great Britain from 35% to 43% because the British were dumping cheap goods on the American market as part of a policy of underselling and driving out of business U.S. producers, flooding the U.S. market with cheap British goods. And he increased tariffs on the British dramatically. But at the same time, when he was president, he also cut tariffs for a number of countries. And in some cases, he eliminated tariffs on a number of nations who had fair trade relations with the United States. And in fact, this question of reciprocity as a cornerstone, not only of his economic policy, but his trade policy, and in fact, his entire foreign policy, that this concept of reciprocity was an integral part of America's foreign policy. This was actually the subject of the last speech that McKinley gave. The last speech he gave the day before he was assassinated was on the subject of reciprocity. Now, the why don't you put the chart back up again, Tony?
Sure. Sorry, just a moment.
Yeah, because I want to explain to people a little bit of what's happened in the recent years. All right, so you go to where it says GATT. People can see that, GATT, 1947. At that point, the general tariff rate, it fluctuated from country to country and product to product, but the general tariff rate in 1947 on imported goods was 38%. So that's where it stood when Roosevelt died. In 1947, under Harry Truman, 38%. In 1947, under Harry Truman, America joined the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which from the beginning was committed to the British policy of free trade. This is, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. It's called GATT. And from the beginning, it was enunciated as one of the goals of GATT to eliminate all tariffs and to create a world order of free trade among nations. So if you look at the chart, you can see what happened. And in just 3 years, after signing the GATT treaty, the American tariff rate went from 38% between 35 and 38% down to 14%, to the level of where it was under Woodrow Wilson. 3 years, our tariffs were reduced from 35 to 40% to about 14%. And then, as you can see, beginning, 1945, 1950, it continues to go down slowly but surely. In 1995, I will say that by 1975, even before the World Trade Organization, by 1975, U.S. tariff rates had been reduced to an average of 5%. 5%. The lowest, the absolute lowest in the entire history of the United States. Lower than Andrew Jackson, lower than Woodrow Wilson, the lowest by 1975. And it continued to go down. And then in 1995, we joined the World Trade Organization. We were a founding member. The World Trade Organization was founded in 1995, and the United States was a founding member of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization was created by GATT. It came directly out of GATT. They had, at that time, these meetings, what was called the Uruguay Round, where they came up with this plan to form the World Trade Organization. And one thing I will say, sort of just as an aside here, is that if you go back to our literature, the literature of our organization, of the LaRouche political movement, to that period, Lyndon LaRouche was a vocal critic of the GATT Uruguay Round and the founding of the World Organization. He attacked it from the beginning. So we're not a Johnny come lately to this subject. Um, the then later, I mean, so you had the World Trade Organization, formed in 1995. Then you had the Free Trade Agreement between the United States and Canada in 1993. Then you had the NAFTA Treaty, the Free Trade Agreement between Mexico and the United States, a little bit later. And I think that was also in 1993. And then in 2001, China was allowed entry in 2001, 23 years ago. China was allowed entry into the World Trade Organization, basically, removing all restrictions on the export of cheap Chinese goods into the United States and other markets. And that really has brought us to where we are today. Now, you can't really tell from looking at this chart, but according to, statistics vary based on who you're reading and who you're looking at. But according to what appear to be reliable sources, as of 2020, the general tariff rate that is imposed on, or let's put it this way, as of 2017, as of the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated, at the end of the Obama administration, the general tariff rate on imported goods in the United States was between 2.5% and 3%. So essentially, as of 2017, for all practical purposes, we had no tariffs. 2.5%. What is that? So and this, if you look at that period there on that chart from, beginning, 1980, 1970s, 1980, through to 2017, this is what today people refer to as the era of globalization, the globalized economy, globalization, which is really a very bad term for it because, our economy, we live within a global economy. We export, we import, we trade, we get things from countries that we can't produce. We get things from countries that are, made really excellently and are top quality and we need them. And we export our material. It is a global economy. It was a global economy when William McKinley was president. That's what his policy of reciprocity was all about. We trade with countries, right? And we want a fair playing field with countries. And they can expect a fair playing field from us. It's going to be reciprocal, but we're going to have tariffs. But it is a global economy. So what we've been living through for the last 40 years or so is not really a globalized economy. It's an economic and trade system, governed by a dictatorship of the British policy of free trade. It is a free trade society, and that's what we've been living through. Now, and look, this is not something new. It is a British policy. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, the idea of free trade economics, I mean, American protectionist policies in the 1820s, 30s, 40s were, intensely attacked from London and by some of the financial interests in the United States who were connected to London. They were denounced. American tariffs were denounced back then, before the Civil War. There were a number of key individuals involved in this at that time. I mean, Adam Smith was long dead, I believe, but you had people like Richard Cobden, You had people like John Stuart Mill and his father, and you had others um, who propagandized, who organized for free trade, that this was the only democratic system, you know, and what have you. And then if you look at the period after the Civil War, um, during this era of American protectionism in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, um, what the British did was they created organizations in the United States to oppose the protective tariffs. One of these was called the Free Trade League, sponsored by a bunch of New York and Boston, oligarchs. These were also known as the Cobden Clubs, named after Richard Cobden. There was another organization called the American Social Science Association, which was involved in more than just economic policies. They were involved in a lot of nasty stuff, but they also they very much became a spokesman, a propagandist for free trade policies. And these were the circles, there were more than just these two organizations. But these organizations like the American Social Science Association and the Free Trade League and the Cobden Clubs, these and other organizations, this was the milieu that Woodrow Wilson came out of. And when Wilson came in, he imposed these free trade policies. Now, look, let me just do one thing here. Yeah, okay. All right, we're doing okay. Uh, um, Look, I want to say one thing. I don't want to dwell on it, but I want to say one thing about the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This, you can see it on the chart there, um, because this is routinely used by people who attack high tariffs. You know, and what occurred after the stock market crashed in 1929, and the economy started grinding to a halt, and factories started shutting down, is that the Republicans in Congress, and it might have been bipartisan, I don't know. Anyway, Congress passed a tariff called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. These were the two sponsors of it. Um, uh, uh, um, uh, and was signed into law by Herbert Hoover, um, which reimposed a very high protective tariff. Now, according to this chart on the screen, it looks like it's the highest in history, but it really wasn't. It was about the same level as the McKinley tariff, but it was, they reimposed a high protective tariff. All right, you could take this down. I'm not going to talk about the chart anymore, Tony. Um, I think you get the point. And to this day, in universities and Ivy League, campuses, and in various economists, you get all kinds of people who say that what Trump is trying to do is to bring back the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was a major contributing factor to the Depression, that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was wrong, it was catastrophic, and it actually accelerated the Depression. And this is just not true at all. There's no truth to that at all. Um, and in fact, Trump answered this um, in an interview, or in a post he put up on Truth Social in June of this year, a couple months ago. There was a whole discussion of tariffs going on, and someone brought up Smoot-Hawley, and Trump personally posted a response, and I'll read you his response. He said, "The Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed after the Great Depression had already started. It had nothing to do with creating the Depression. If you want to study tariffs and how powerful they are, study the administration of President William McKinley. So that's what Trump said. And he's right about that. The fact is, you know, uh, one of the things that people point to is they say, after the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed, U.S. exports dropped dramatically because other countries began putting up tariffs. They exaggerate the extent of that, but that did happen. Exports did go down, but that was never. But people don't understand what the intention of the Smoot-Hawley tariff was. The intention was to reorient. Here we are. It's 1930. We're going into the Depression. Factories, steel mills, auto plants, farms going out of business, shutting down. The purpose of Smoot-Hawley was to reorient U.S. production towards the domestic market. In other words, that by putting up a high protective tariff, we could keep out imported goods and we could increase production in the United States for the domestic market. In other words, we would replace the sale of imported goods by increasing production in the United States. Now, that was the thinking behind it. Now, it is the case that that alone could not have reversed the Depression, but you can understand why they did it. And the fact is, it actually partially worked. That in 1930, 1931, 1932, there was a gradual increase of certain manufacturing sectors in the United States, because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It partially worked. And really, if you want to get the kind of thinking behind it, you also should look at the case of Henry Ford. Because after the stock market crashed in 1929, and things began shutting down, Henry Ford did something which was really extraordinary. What he said and what he did was he said, if we shut down, if we close plants, if we do what everyone else is doing, it's going to be a spiral downwards. So he said, what we're going to do, what the Ford Motor Company is going to do, and this is like in 1930, he said what the Ford Motor Company is going to do is we're going to increase production. And that's what they did. Because his argument is that if you increase production, if you put people back to work, if you're producing things, people are going to buy those things, and that you could produce your way domestically out of, the economic collapse. So the mindset of what Ford was trying to do and the mindset of Smoot-Hawley were not that much different. Now, ultimately, it didn't work. And after a certain period of time, Ford had to abandon what he was doing. And ultimately, the Smoot-Hawley tariff did not succeed. But, the motivation behind it was really not that bad. And it could have worked, except for one thing. Because what was, the reality is that, what happened after 1929 was not some kind of crisis in manufacturing or in production or agriculture. It was a financial meltdown. It was a crisis within, the imperial central banking system. I mean, look, this, as people know, the stock market crashed in 1929. The agricultural speculative bubble had begun collapsing, more than a year earlier. The futures and options markets and all of that. But this was the popping of a speculative bubble. And it existed not just in the United States, it existed throughout Europe, it existed in London, it existed everywhere. This massive financial bubble of enormous amounts of speculative debt. And this brought everything down. You had obviously the stock market crash in 1929, but then it worsened from there. You got the beginning of bank failures, runs on banks, things like that. And then in Europe in 1931, the dam broke. You had the collapse of several major banks in Europe. Now, among them, some of the most, I'll mention three of them that were among the more significant, but there were more than just these three, is that in May of 1931, um, the Credit Anstalt Bank in Austria collapsed, went out, shut its doors. Then in July, the Landesbank, then Rhine province, the Rhine province Landesbank also shut its doors. And then in July, the Donat Bank shut its doors. These are major financial institutions just vanishing. And by the end of 19, I mean, the crisis was enormous. We were on the precipice of literally the entire banking system throughout parts of Europe vanishing. So what happened was that um, in mid-July of 1931, Germany announced that it was leaving the gold standard, the British gold standard. And then only 2 weeks later, the British government announced that Britain was leaving the gold standard. And the point I just want to make about Smoot-Hawley is that, there was no way to deal with this just with tariffs. It was not that a high protective tariff. People say if we had lowered tariffs, if we had more trade, this is the argument you get. This would have kept things going. This is all just, these people are just idiots. The high protective tariffs were a good idea. The problem was that what we were confronted with was a meltdown of first the European and then the American banking system. You know, uh, you know, this was a crisis within the speculative practices of the global central banking system, and really the only thing that could have solved this was a return to a Hamiltonian policy of national public credit, which is what Roosevelt began to do in several different ways after he came into office. But I just bring this up. It's sort of an aside, but you hear these attacks on Trump's tariff policy. It's Smoot-Hawley, it's lunacy, it's trade war. You hear all of this stuff. And if you begin to examine it a little bit, what you find is that this is all just smoke and mirrors. This is all just, a bill, a very shady bill of goods that you're being sold by people who are pushing, free trade and financial speculation and economic looting. Smoot-Hawley did not cause the depression. It did not contribute to the depression. Um, you know, so anyway, that's all I'll say about it. The this is a little bit disjointed, but I'm trying to raise different aspects of this because various things come up on it. And one of the things I want to mention is this proposal that's come up to use, uh, the revenue from higher tariffs to reduce the income tax or reduce other taxes. I mean, there was actually, I think he introduced it as legislation, or maybe he announced his intention to introduce such legislation. I'm not sure. But there was this proposal from Congressman Massey to impose an across the board 10% tariff, which is probably, I don't know, triple what we have now, but maybe an across the board 10% tariff on imported goods, and to use that revenue to reduce income taxes. And some people again ridicule this, poo-poo it, and what have you. But it is worth looking a little bit at the history of this. So that's what I'm going to do right at this moment. Um, uh, you know, and I'll begin by saying that the national income tax, which we all pay today, this was brought in um, simultaneously with the reduction of tariffs. And the people who brought it in twice, first in the 1890s and then later under Woodrow Wilson, the people who brought in the income tax were very explicit. I mean, they stated it openly that the reason we needed the income tax was to replace the revenue from reducing the tariffs, that they were determined to reduce tariffs, and that therefore we would need a new source of revenue, and therefore we would need an income tax. Now, in 1891, at the point that the McKinley Tariff was adopted, the United States government, our government, received about 40% of its revenue from tariffs. 40% of all federal revenue came from tariffs, right? It fluctuated from year to year, but that's the general range, for about 40%. But we also received another 35% from two excise taxes. We had a national tax on alcohol production and alcohol sales. This was a national tax on alcohol, kind of like what George Washington did with the whiskey tax. And it was a pretty stiff tax. And 25% of all revenue came from the whiskey tax or the alcohol tax in 1891. We also got 10% of our federal revenue from a national tax, excise tax on tobacco products. So in 1891, 85% of federal revenue, 85% came from tariffs, the alcohol tax, and the tobacco tax. Right now, what happened was that in 1892, Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, got elected, and the Democrats took control of Congress. One of the first things they did was to pass an act called the Wilson-Gorman Tariff, which reduced tariff rates by 10% in 1893, actually. They reduced tariff rates by 10%. And simultaneous with that act, they passed a national income tax, which is the first peacetime income tax in American history. We had had a temporary income tax, which was really restricted to the very wealthy. We had had a temporary income tax during the Civil War, but that tax expired at the end of the Civil War. So this is the first peacetime income tax in history, 1893, the Wilson-Gorman income tax. And they said at the time, if we're going to reduce tariffs by 10%, we're going to have to have money from somewhere. So they passed, an income tax. However, 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that income tax unconstitutional, saying that Congress did not have the authority to pass an income tax. So at that point, it didn't exist anymore. That is when the campaign began in earnest to pass an amendment to the Constitution, a constitutional amendment um, for the income tax. And, you know, the campaign was really spearheaded by a group of Wall Street financiers, and probably the leading one, not the only one, but probably the leading one was a guy named Nelson Aldrich. And Aldrich, um, uh, uh, not only spearheaded the drive for the income tax, but he also was the guy later on who, uh, with the Aldrich plan in 1909, was really the either the key guy or one of the two or three key guys who were responsible for the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Right now, both by 1905, 1908, 1912, both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were committed and were fighting, number one, to reduce tariffs, and number two, to get a constitutional amendment passed for the income tax. And then this was all done, under the Wilson administration, under Woodrow Wilson. As I said before, tariff rates were reduced from over 40% down to 13 or 14%, and the income tax was brought in to supply the revenue lost from those tariffs. So there is a direct connection right from the beginning between the question of the income tax and the tariffs. It's not like Congressman Massey made this up. Whether you like it or not, the two things are connected from the very beginning. Then something else happened, which is that in 1920, Prohibition went into effect. And when Prohibition went into effect, all of the revenue from the national alcohol tax vanished. There was no more national alcohol tax because there was no more sale of alcohol. So in 1891, 65% of our government's revenue came from protective tariffs and the alcohol tax. 65%. And by 1920, the tariffs had been slashed to almost nothing, and the alcohol tax had been eliminated. At that point, the income tax becomes the primary source of government revenue. So that's what you have. I mean, that's really what it was. So, I bring this up, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. But, in the time that I have remaining here, what I want to do is, I wanted to cover Smoot-Hawley and the income tax because, these are things that come up in people's minds. But I want to get back more to the question of the intention of tariffs, the power of tariffs. Get back to this question of the fact you cannot have the American system of economics without tariffs. You cannot say we're going to have a Hamiltonian banking system, but we can have low tariffs. These two things are inseparable, and that was understood, by Hamilton, by John Quincy Adams, by Abraham Lincoln. It was clearly understood. And I want to get back to, this is tied to the question somewhat of the income tax. Because if you're going to have tariffs, high tariffs, Massey is proposing 10%. I've heard Trump in some of his recent statements, threatening to slap tariffs of 100% or 200% on countries that are dumping, goods into the United States. That doesn't mean we'd have a general tariff rate of 100%, but I could tell you that under McKinley, and under Lincoln, when we had a general tariff rate of 40, 41, 42, 45%, there were items that were taxed 100% because the general tariff rate is the average, right? And there were items that were taxed 100% because you wanted to keep them out. Um, and it's not just a question of revenue. You wanted to keep these things out. But look, let's get back to this question of, on the one hand, um, you know, tariffs are protectionist, right? You put up protective tariffs, like in the case of our auto industry, or some other manufacturing concern. You put up protective tariffs to protect these industries. You want to protect them. You don't want them to be destroyed or strangled in the cradle because other countries are dumping cheap goods in the United States. That's the most obvious question of protective tariffs, right? But there is another way to think about it as well. Um, you know, because, and this is what Hamilton writes about in his report on manufacturers. He says, that just keeping, cheap imports out, goods you don't want in our country, keeping them out, that's just part of it. That's, in a sense, defensive. You're defending your country against this invasion of cheap imports. But he says there's also a positive role to this. And this, again, has to do with tariff revenue, right? Because on the one hand, we could do what Massey is proposing, or, even what Trump is. I mean, I've heard Trump lately saying we should look at the whole question of whether or not we should have income taxes. That sounds pretty extreme to some people, pretty crazy. Personally, I'm not so sure if it's so extreme. I mean, we got the income tax when they took down the tariffs. If you put the tariffs back up, do you really need the income tax? I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not going to say that one or the other is the answer. You certainly could reduce income taxes if you had high tariffs. But that's just part of it. To get back to what Hamilton says in the report on manufacturers, what he says is that we can see, if you have tariffs, they don't necessarily the revenue from those tariffs don't necessarily all have to go into the general fund, the general government, wherever the government keeps its money that it takes in, the general fund. It's not just like, income taxes coming in where it's all coming into a general fund. You really don't have to do that with tariffs. You could be more selective on what you do with revenue from the tariffs. Now, Hamilton proposed several things. He proposed, and I've talked about this before, but I think it bears talking about again. He proposed a system of what he called premiums and bounties. And I'm not going to go into the hair-splitting differences between them tonight. But, what he said is that we can essentially take part of the tariff revenue, isolate or split off part of the tariff revenue and direct that money, sort of quarantine that money and direct it into projects and individuals who will create new industries, new technologies, new scientific breakthroughs, direct payments to scientists, to inventors, to startup companies. They didn't call them startup companies then, but that's what they were, into new startup companies that are bringing online new revolutionary technologies. That is that a portion of the tariff revenue can go into frontier technology, industry, science, including the creation of entirely new industries. And obviously, certain things come to mind in this regard. And again, Mike Carr should be on here because he could give you a dozen different examples. But even something like, what do you call it, modular fusion reactors. Some of these I think are going out of business, or they can't get any money, to come online. You could use a portion of tariff revenue to set up a special fund for something like that, with payments directly into these companies or into their laboratories or to their scientists. This is what Hamilton proposed in 1789 in the Report on Manufacturers. I mean, this is an entirely different concept of the power of how tariffs could be used. Now, unfortunately, Hamilton got his high protective tariff, but he did not get the bounties and premiums. Congress never acted on it. But there's nothing to stop us from doing that again today. Or I'll give you another idea, and this is not something that Hamilton proposed, but I'll give you another idea. Certain people have raised the idea of creating something like a national infrastructure bank, right? Well, if you had, an enormous amount of revenue from high tariffs coming into the United States, it seems to me that it would be at least feasible. Whether you would want to do it this way or not, I'm not certain. But it seems to me it would be at least feasible that you could take a portion of these tariffs, not only to maybe build some infrastructure, but you could take a portion of these tariffs to capitalize something like a national infrastructure bank, which then, based on that capitalization of the revenue from tariffs, could begin to issue credit for some of the most important infrastructure projects in the United States. I don't see why you couldn't do something like that. I don't know. I think it's worth looking at. I think these are the kind of things that we should see if we can get the Trump administration to start looking at. In other words, sure, we could use tariffs to cut income taxes. I'm not against that. But we could also use tariffs in the way that Hamilton talked about, where we're launching a manufacturing, scientific, and technological revolution, ongoing revolutions, ongoing developments, ongoing inputs, which will enrich the whole country. This could be done. This is what Hamilton wanted to do. So, look, just sort of, in closing, what I want to say is, again, this is a little scattered, but I'm trying to cover a lot of topics, none of them really in depth, but just, to provoke people in certain different kinds of ways. But look, one of the other things Trump has been saying in his speeches is he's been saying, we're told that we have to have free trade, like through the World Trade Organization. We have to have free trade because, countries like China and other countries are developing nations, poor developing nations, and a lot of these countries are. But what Trump has said in response to that is he said, well, how about us? Aren't we at this point a developing nation? Haven't we lost tens and tens of thousands of factories? I thought it was hundreds of thousands. Someone corrected me. I think it's at tens of thousands, but it's a hell of a lot of factories everywhere. Not just the big steel mills, but the little little plants that build cardboard boxes that, employ 50 or 100 people, or some other little place in, Tennessee or something where they make buttons, or shoelaces, and they employ 50 people, 100 people. They're all gone. Everything is gone. millions upon millions of manufacturing jobs. It's all gone, you know, and we are a developing nation at this point. And this is what we have to address. And what we have got to do is we have got to think big, you know. Um, and this gets to a certain cultural question. But look, we've got to think big, you know. And when people think about economic development today, they think way too small. Even a lot of people, you know, say, we got to bring manufacturing back into the country. We got to do this, we got to do that. Most of the people who say these things, their heart is in the right place, but they're thinking way too small. They have no idea. Look, there is almost no one alive in this country. I shouldn't say no one. Very few people. There are very few people alive in this country today who have any real concept of what a productive economy is. People think that if a new Walmart gets built in their hometown, or a new Starbucks opens, or the city builds new bike paths, you know, or maybe someone builds 10 miles of, you know, a light rail system, you know, that this is, you know, economic development, you know. People have no concept of it. You know, look, we built the Transcontinental Railroad in 4 years. I live in the Bay Area. They built a BART extension, a BART extension. BART is the Bay Area Rapid Transit. They built a 10-mile extension, 10-mile extension of 10 miles of new tracks and a new station. It took 20 years, 20 years to build this BART extension. 20 years, 10 miles. The Transcontinental Railroad was built in 4 years. Or forget infrastructure for a second. I mentioned Henry Ford. You know, some people who are on this call might have heard of something called the River Rouge plant, which is really not a plant, it's a complex, many plants. The River Rouge complex, you know, in Michigan, where Henry Ford, you know, this is where he started mass producing the Model A's. You know, the Model T's he had been building before this, but this is where he started mass producing the Model A's, right? Uh, you know, at its peak, River Rouge had 75,000 workers. 75,000 workers in one auto plant. Now, it was more than one plant, but one complex. One complex. 75,000 workers. They built their own steel. They had their own steel furnace on site. They produced their own electricity on site. There were 100 miles, 100 miles of railroad track within the complex, right? Massive, massive. And this wasn't Henry Ford's the only place he met automobiles by any stretch of the imagination. People have no concept of the power of a productive economy, you know, of what can be done. And, you know, this is what we really have to, you know, turn around culturally. Look, you know, if you look at, I don't want you to put the chart back up, but if you go from that period of the 1970s, you know, when we reached the level of having almost no tariffs, and also the era after we got rid of the Bretton Woods system and went into just a completely, you know, globalized financial speculative system. If you look at that era from the 1970s down to today, we have gone from being a nation of producers to a nation of consumers. And you say this to people, and people go, but people don't get it. People don't get it. Think of 75,000 people working in one complex to build automobiles. One complex, 75,000 people, you know? Wouldn't it be nice What do you think it would mean for the city of Detroit or the people who live in Detroit if they were to build another industrial complex in Detroit that employed 75,000 people at decent wages? What would that do for the city of Detroit and the people living in Detroit? And what if we were to do that, replicate that all over the country? You know, um, the look, we were at one time a nation of builders, of inventors, of discoverers, of entrepreneurs in the best sense of entrepreneurs. Um, and instead, we have become a culture dominated by the axioms, pleasure oriented axioms of Hollywood, of the oligarchy, of this, these type of people. All these absolutely disgusting and degenerate creeps from Hollywood you see at Kamala Harris events, you know. That's her audience, right? You know, they don't want to build anything. You know, they just want to produce more degenerate entertainment. Um, this is not the way it used to be. Protective tariffs for 160 years, 40 years from 1861 to 1901 of tariffs over 40%. Manufacturing, infrastructure, industry, science, technology, right? This is what defined America. And we have to get back to that. Now, obviously, we're beginning to see signs of this. You know, the most obvious, the most glaring, example of a return to this productive outlook is someone like Elon Musk. You know, I mean, I heard him say on one of the interviews he did recently, which I didn't even realize, is 92% of all of the space launches in the world, 92% of all the space launches are done by SpaceX. Now, I heard him say that. I don't know if it's true, but he said it publicly. Um, and obviously, it's just astounding what he's doing. And there are all kinds of people out there, all kinds of people working on revolutionary technologies, working on, all kinds of new projects, all kinds of frontier scientific projects, all kinds of things which could revolutionize life on Earth. But they're not going to get anywhere under a Biden-Harris administration or a Harris-Walz administration, you know. Um, Meanwhile, Trump is talking about tariffs. He's talking about going to Mars. He's talking about. This is the kind of stuff he's talking about. So we have to resurrect, something which people really have a hard time wrapping their minds around. People say, "Oh yeah, I'm optimistic. I want a productive future. I want fusion energy. I want the space program." Okay, that's great. But people really, most people, in my experience, really do not comprehend what a productive economy, an American system productive economy really looks like. And we could even do better than they did in the past. That's what's really exciting. So I'm going to stop right there, Tony.
Terrific. Very, very appropriate for our election coming right up.